This is a rather unique letter. It's unique in a number of ways. Let's get into that. I think it's kind of, we learn a lot by inspection. But let's start with an introduction. So in the roaring 20s, there was an American who was in the real estate business, and he said that there were three keys to real estate. Location, location, location. I think we've all heard that, right? Well, similarly, I think there are three keys to understanding truth in God's Word. Context, context, context. Get the context wrong, the understanding will go awry as well. John Wycliffe. So I don't know if you guys know John Wycliffe. He translated the entire Bible into English 2 centuries before the King James Version. And he said this in quaint English: "It shall greatly help ye to understand Scripture, if thou mark not only what is spoken or written, but to whom, to whom, with what words, at what time, where, to what intent, with what circumstances, considerating what goeth before and what followeth." Let's decompose that. There's a little bit of who, what, when, where, why, right? I mean, that's one way to look at this, right? Who does it speak to? Whom is it written? What words? What time? Where? Why? What circumstances? Can we correlate that? What goes before in the passage? What comes after? Don't isolate things to the point where you take them out of context. To this we can add how. So what's the problem with understanding Romans? Well, it's my conviction that the context, again, it's paramount importance to understanding the Scriptures. And unfortunately, our culture, Western culture, if you will, is saddled with the garbage dump of tradition. That's the word there, tradition. It's a lot of refuse that's been heaped up in what's called church history. Church history. Okay. This thing called the church.
Mark, maybe the mic a little closer might help. Thank you.
I'm afraid if I move this, we get that.
Steamship.
Is that better?
Yeah.
All right. So unfortunately, in Western culture, we have the church history, so-called church history, which I think is essentially satanic, right? In the light of Satan's known attempts to substitute his lies for God's truth. Little sarcasm there at the bottom. God promised to build up his church. Gates of hell would not prevail against it, but he never said that the gates of hell would not put up a good fight.
Is that you?
No, that was...
It sounds like you.
We won't go there. All right, so tradition is really quite flimsy when you get right down to it, right? Tradition would have us believe the following things, right? That Apostle Paul was writing to a Christian church in Rome. He was introducing himself to the congregation. Obviously, there must be many Christians in Rome because that was the capital city of the Roman Empire. Paul wanted to visit the Christians to establish a church. And he was trailblazing. Why? Because Peter would follow, right, and become the first bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope, right? This is what tradition would have us to believe. And then he got crucified upside down by the Emperor Nero, etc., etc. Tradition versus truth. They're almost diametrically opposed when you think about it. All right, here's our outline. So we're going to talk about this decomposition using Wycliffe as kind of the outline, right? The kind of the inspection, if you will. And then we will get into some specific examples applying the context. Try to understand some of the things that are said, because Romans is a weighty book. In preparing for this talk, I went through it twice, and it makes my head hurt. There's just so much there, which we cannot cover in an hour, right? Okay, New Testament time periods. You are here, right, contextually. Contextually, you are between Christ's earthly ministry and what we now know as the dispensation of grace. Let's go one step further. These are notional dates. I would argue with some of them. But I think what's important here is just to recognize there were at least 5 letters written prior to Acts 28:28, Romans being the 6th. This date's probably closer to that one than what's shown, although we could argue that, but that's not important. I think what's more important is Romans is probably the last book that Paul wrote prior to what we know is that last period, which Andy and Ginny were talking about, the fourth section of the book of Acts. The dates are important, I think, when you kind of go from here, right? Because if you take 66 AD as the date of Acts 28:28, the notional date when that statement was recorded, the General Titus destroyed Jerusalem 4 years later, right? The other books of the New Testament were probably completed by AD 81. That would make John pretty old at that point when the Apocalypse was written. So just to get a sense of, trying to frame that in detail. All right, to whom was Romans written? Tradition tells us it was written to a church at Rome. There's no introduction in the book that says that, right? If you read the introduction to the book of Romans, it doesn't say to the church at Rome. It says to all that be at Rome. The word ecclesia only appears 3 times in the book of Romans. It appears at the end in the salutations. This is a marked contrast, right, to the other books that were written during the Acts period. If you go and look at the introductions to Thessalonians, for instance, go back up to that. Go back and look at these introductions. They're addressed to the ecclesia, but that is certainly not the case. Whoops, back up with regards to the book of Romans. And there's a reason for that. If the epistle had been directed to an ecclesia at Rome, then those who were not believers in Jesus as the Messiah, right? You could still be Jewish and maybe not be cognizant of the fact that Messiah had come in the person of Jesus. That would have excluded some persons there who were of Jewish descent. That was clearly not Paul's intent, right? He makes an appeal to all of the Jews. Make sure I'm on the right slide here. He makes an appeal to all the Jews. He says, your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Right? So he's talking to them as kinsmen, right? They're all descendants of Abraham. So if this is the traditional view, what's the truth, right? Well, the truth is this book was written to the Jews in Rome. It wasn't directed at the Gentiles. There's some fine points there, but let's make sure we understand that. It wasn't directed to the Gentiles directly. And you can see that from the context. In 2:17, Paul says, behold, you are called a Jew. Well, that doesn't make any sense if you're, right? If you're Italian, it doesn't make any sense. It's clear when Paul refers to the audience as them that know the law. He's referring to Jewish law. If you were a Hellenist, that wouldn't be your context, right? Once again, context here is what we're trying to bring into the picture. The audience is called to all that be in Rome, beloved of God. Well, that's the nation of Israel. Beloved of God is a phrase, you can pick it up out of Jeremiah 31:3. I can read that. To flip screens here. Jeremiah 31:3. Let's just read that. Old Testament context is important, right? Now we're applying Old Testament. Jeremiah 31:3. Make sure I get the right reference here. Well, what 31:3 says, the Lord hath appeared of old unto me, saying, yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love, right? With an olam love. Therefore, with loving kindness I have drawn thee. The nation of Israel was always in Jehovah's mind. It was never out of Jehovah's mind insofar as this time period, right, is concerned. All right, well, were there believing proselytes in Rome at this time? No. Yeah, there were probably some number of proselytes. There were probably some number of Jews in Rome that had heard of Jesus of Nazareth. We were talking about that. We were discussing that in Andy and Ginny's portion, right? The word had been scattered with the disciples, even the apostles. We'll call them apostles. It's the people who were scattered with the message. There were probably three classes of people in Rome when you think about it from the perspective of the Jewish population that was there. Three classes. You probably had people that had heard that Jesus had come and he was the Messiah. There were some that maybe didn't believe that. There were some maybe who were on the fence. Probably some that had never heard about him at all. We know that there were certainly people on the day of Pentecost, right? Let's just actually read that section. So let's go to Acts chapter 2:5, because that calls it out, I think, in detail, right? Get the verse here, right? So they were dwelling in Jerusalem, Jews, devout men, out of every nation under heaven, okay? And when you get down to, they list a whole bunch of places in the Roman Empire, right? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, dwellers of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Asia being Asia Minor, right? What we now know as Turkey. Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, Cyrene, strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes. So there were people from Rome at the day of Pentecost. Would they have taken back to Rome what they experienced? Certainly, certainly. Were they commissioned to herald a message to? No. We don't have any record of that, right? We don't have a record that says they were told to go back to Rome and herald this message. They would have probably told about their experiences. Something really wild happened while we were in Jerusalem. You're not going to believe this, right? Tongues of fire over people's heads. It's a good example of something that you would tell your friends, I'm sure. All right, so Jews in Rome. There were 5 to 7 synagogues. I think the archaeologist has struggled with this a little bit. The records actually come from the catacombs, that are mentions of, that's a map, you can't read it, it's like an eye chart. There are a lot of good things on the internet. If you look at that in detail, there were 5 sites they've located, they think, in the city of Rome. This particular site here, Ostia Synagogue, is at the port city, Ostia, port city of Rome. That's a particularly well-preserved one. You can see it's an L-shaped building. There's a location to put the scrolls. Ark of the Scrolls. Okay. We're dealing with a diaspora, right? That's in Italy, right? They're near Rome. And if they have a copy, if you were a well-to-do synagogue, you have copies of scrolls. You don't have a Bible like we have it today. It hasn't been put together yet. What they do have is a Septuagint, probably. That's in the Common Koine Greek. Then maybe if they're wealthy, they have other scrolls in Hebrew. Requires you to be able to read multiple languages. But this becomes a case of the average, I'll use that term, an average educated person, right, who can read and write. We don't relate to that too well because all of us have high school educations, right? Don't raise your hand if you don't have one. I don't want to know. But back in that day and age, that was a privilege, right, to be able to read your own language. Any questions so far? All right, so we've talked about this already to some degree. And in Rome, there were probably 50,000 Jews. That's what R.C.H. Lenski estimates, the Lutheran scholar. In Italy, probably 100,000 total at the time in Italy. They had been scattered around the Roman Empire. More to come on that. multiple scatterings, right? You got to remember, I think Nathan brought that up. They had been scattered by the Assyrians, they had been scattered by the Babylonians, they had been scattered by the Greeks, right, by the Macedonians, Alexander the Great. Multiple diaspora events, if you will. So if the Gentiles are not the immediate audience, right, well, what is said about the Gentiles? It's interesting in Romans 11:11. This is the quote, right? Say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. But rather, through their fall, salvation is come to the Gentiles. He's speaking to the Jews again, remember? The they, the pronoun they is referring to the Jews. For to provoke them, the Jews, to jealousy. And then he says in 11:13, Paul says, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my office. So even if this letter is written to the Jews, right, Paul is the apostle to the nations, and making this statement something he's clearly, he has the authority to say it. All right, so most of you have some familiarity with the Roman Empire. But just to put that in context, right, it was broken up in a whole bunch of areas that were run by governors, regional governors. And I think the more interesting, population statistics. Italy, 100,000. Egypt, at least 1 million. There were a lot in just Alexandria, right? Over 100,000 just in Alexandria. North Africa, 200,000. Asia Minor, another 200,000. Syria, Mesopotamia, probably 1 million, probably from the original 2 diaspora. Judea, 2.5 million. This doesn't add up to 8, but that's because it's not complete, right? There were others in other parts of the Roman Empire. The populations it's just the statistics aren't that good, right? We don't have a census in the sense that we get them today with the details. But that gives you some sense, right, of how spread out the Jews were when section 2 of Andy and Ginny's description took place. There were a lot of places they had to go. They're very spread out. Well, so once again, we're trying to establish, context here. We'll make these slides available. Feel free to go look into this in more detail. These are sites of ancient synagogues. So as was described, right, the Jews tended to hang out in neighborhoods, and they had the neighborhood synagogue, right? There are many of these that archaeologically have been uncovered. That's a good sense of where the ones were in the Northwest, which Paul appeared to have spent a lot of his time in with his apostolic journeys. All right, how was this letter conveyed? Now we're on the how piece. Well, this is a pretty long letter, right? It's 16 chapters. How many scrolls do you think that would fit on? Come on, we're in the first century, right, of the Common Era. Probably 4 to 5 scrolls. I don't know, because they had to write it by hand, right? 4 to 5 scrolls. So it's a stack of scrolls, right, that have got to be moved from wherever they were written to Rome. So likely they were written from Corinth. How do we know this? We know this, we think we know this, right? Likely and trusting, down here. The conveyance was likely by means of entrusting to an outcalled one. That individual is called out in 16:1. Phoebe, our sister, a servant of the outcalled from Cenchrea. Here's the detail map. If you know a little bit about Greece, there's a little isthmus that connects Peloponnesia with Achaia. So Athens is over here, Sparta is down here. So it's a little isthmus, and here's the blow-up. Cenchrea is the port city on the Athens side. Straits of Salamis, you know anything about the war with the Persian Empire, that battle took place over here. So a lot of maritime traffic. That's likely the place she left out of, right? Several weeks' journey just to get to the Jewish community in Rome. That's if you don't get into a shipwreck, right? If you don't get stuck on Melita or someplace, right? Crete or something, right? The message did not seem to reach the chief men of the Jews. We know that from Acts 28, verse 21. But if it got distributed, right, to the 5 to 7 synagogues in Rome, then it would have set the necessary ground, right, for Paul to make his visit. Why did Paul write the letter? Well, I think he communicates that pretty clearly in verses 11 and 15 of chapter 1. I'll just read those real quick. He says, "For I long to see you, that I may impart unto you a spiritual gift, some spiritual gift, and to the end that you may be established. That is, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith of both you and me." Their common Jewish faith. Everybody in Rome that was of Jewish heritage would have had the common Jewish faith. "Now I would not have you be ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I have proposed to come to you, but was let hitherto, that I may have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles." We'll talk about that word Gentiles here in a bit. That can be a bit confusing, right? He's calling among other Gentiles. "I am a debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So, as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also." So the implication is Paul hadn't preached, he had not communicated a gospel to those in Rome yet, right? Until he wrote this letter. That's the implication, I think, from that statement. The last note there on that slide, it's important to take note that Paul calls himself a debtor to both the Greek and to the barbarian, meaning the educated and the uneducated. That's the contrast that he's making there. So this falls into the category of consider the circumstances that we saw earlier from John Wycliffe. The Hellenists, right? It's translated Greek or Greeks in the King James Version. It's also translated, it's a word that's translated Gentiles, right, frequently. More often than not. It's translated Greek a couple times, right, a handful of times. So there's two meanings for this word, right? Greek by nationality or signifying Greek culture. The word is used interchangeably for both of those. The Romans revered the Hellenistic culture. If you look at the maps of the settlements, the Greeks settled the southern portion of the Italian peninsula. There was a lot of Greek influence, and if you know much about the Roman Empire, their pantheism, for instance, had a Roman god correlation with every Greek god. They just gave him a different name, but it was the same set of things. So they were enamored, with Greek culture. A couple other things to consider here, just in contrast, right, in the scriptures. The other word to consider is, what word is translated the nations, right? In Greek, you've got ethnos and ethnikos. It's Greek words that are translated for nations, or national, if you use it as an adjective. The Hebrew word, goy. Goy is almost like an epithet. The nice translation is foreigner, right? The Jewish community, it was us and them. The word goy always communicates foreigner, uncircumcised. No relationship, no promise from God like we have from what God promised Abraham, right? So you've got a couple words here: Gentiles, heathen, nations. This is what comes out in the King James, right? Whenever we come across these words, ask yourself, what's the context? You've got to stop. Ask yourself, what's the context? The technique I use is I stop and I do a transliteration. I look it up and say, okay, what word is that? Is that the word for Hellenist? Or is that the word for ethnos? And just bring it over. But then the connotations and the thought process, just like we do with other words like apostello, which are kind of, right? It's a multi-word translation. You can bring it across and ask yourself, what's this referring to? All right, so let's take these contextual elements that we've identified and let's look at a collection of examples. The book of Romans is full of, what's the right term? It's full of truths, probably more so than any other book in the New Testament. I mean, if you went through and itemized the list of subjects that Paul brings up, right? It kind of dwarfs any other book in the New Testament. This is a subset. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just to touch on a couple of things here and apply this, this methodology that we've got. This is the short list of examples. I may have actually modified that, but let's go through and see what we got here. All right, application. Let's apply what we've learned and say, okay, the right message. The epistle to the Romans is a gospel message. That's what it is, right? Paul says that. Paul says, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. Not a servant, he's a slave. I'm called, kletos, same word that we have an out called. So he's called or positioned an apostle, commissioned one, separated unto the gospel of God. Jehovah's gospel. He's talking to Jews, right? That's his primary audience. So remove the second verse, it's a parenthetical, right? Go to verse 3. Those two verses should just go right together, fit right together. Concerning his son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who was generated of the seed of David according to the flesh. So he's appealing to all of the Jews in Rome, right? Because he's starting off with gospel of God. He's going to bring Jesus in here, right? That's what he's going to do. It's interesting to see how he starts, right? The Jews were expecting Messiah. Now he's going to tell them, who the Messiah is and was and is, right? This is in stark contrast to that pantheon of gods that we were discussing just a moment ago, right? Worshipped by the Romans. These Jews were in the middle of that. They were surrounded by it, right? There's a monument in Rome called the Pantheon. Guess what that building stands for, right? It's to the pantheon of gods. The word gospel is very flexible, right? Don't be surprised that it's used in this fashion. The noun evangelion occurs 77 times, and the verb evangelizo 55 times. Let's just give you a couple of versions, a couple of examples of that, so that you can see it here. So, gospels are delivered by a divine herald, a divinely commissioned one. They could come directly from God, right? Gospel to Abraham, which is mentioned in Galatians. Let's just go there, right? That came to Abraham directly, right? Galatians 3:6. Let's just read that one real quick. So the point here is it's not always a gospel of salvation. The word gospel is very flexible. It can mean a lot of things. Once again, context. Galatians 3:6 says, even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, know ye therefore that they who were of faith, the same as are the children of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all the nations be blessed. Guess what? The word heathen and the word nations, same word. Same word in Greek. I think the King James translators wanted to get the heathen in here. That was one of their biases, I think is the right word. Zachariah and Elizabeth received a gospel from an angel, right? And evangelizo appears twice. Evangelizo is an interesting construct. I haven't completely figured out the language portion. It appears twice in this passage. It appears twice in this passage. We're familiar with this one, the gospel that came to the shepherds from an angel, right? That the Messiah is born in Bethlehem tonight. You should go see him. Okay. What it says in the Greek is the angel evangelizo to an evangelizo. It's a compound construct. It says I evangelized in evangelization. I'll have to kind of work on that. I have difficulty putting it into English. Same basic concept though. It's a message. It's a good message. It's like good medicine. It's the right medicine. Okay, it's the right message for you, the audience. Okay, so when Paul was putting together, when he wrote the letter to all in Rome, he was constructing a gospel that would fit their needs, not the needs of this traditional thing that the church, quote unquote, would have us to believe. The gospel of the kingdom. First occurrence was out of Jesus' mouth, right? In Matthew 4:23. You don't hear that much in Christian circles, do you? The gospel of the kingdom. It's not the gospel of salvation, right? It's a different message. That occurs 33 times in the New Testament. And then the gospel of God. We mentioned that. It's up in the very first verse in Romans. And that was the right message for the diaspora who were living in Rome. So is there church truth to be found in the book of Romans? That's a question that would come out of church circles, I guess. Well, the answer is not the traditional kind of church truth. This is not a book about church ceremonies or practices or church positions, right? It's not that. Romans is a lot of things, the book of Romans, but it's not that. It's not the character of that book. Tradition tells us there were many Christians in Rome at the time, right, to which Paul addressed his letter. Okay, well, the biblical record basically disagrees with that. It's impossible to tell, right, how many of the Jews in Rome had heard of Jesus as Messiah, right? If they were of the Jewish faith and had knowledge of the Jewish scriptures, they would know that a Messiah was expected. But is there a big Christian church there? No evidence to support that. Well, wasn't Israel cut off at the crucifixion? No. No. Church might have you believe that too, but the fact of the matter is, Jesus said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Jesus said it, it's good enough for me. They were forgiven. People that put him to death. Wasn't Jesus a Christian? Okay, I'm sorry. It's like the most obvious question you could ask. No, Jesus was Jewish. From the day he was conceived to the day that he ascended back to heaven, he was always Jewish. He did not come to earth to start a new religion, as some church history would have you to believe. And that's pretty clear from Matthew 15:24, right? I was not apostello except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I'm not here, Jesus says, I'm not here on earth to start a church. I'm here because I'm sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Well, what about baptism? That is mentioned in Romans, right? We'll get to that in a minute. How much time do I have? So far, so good. All right, so we've touched on the fact that this is the gospel of God, and Paul has tailored his message to the Jewish audience.
15 minutes.
Okay, he's going to bring in Messiah. Oh, good. We're moving along. We're moving on a good clip. The centroid, if you will, for those of Jewish heritage would be the law. Always had been the law, right? It was a spiritual law. Came directly from Jehovah, right? So Paul goes straight to the problem and the misconception. He doesn't beat around the bush. He goes straight to it. He says, the law does not save anyone in and of itself. He says that in Romans 3:19 and 20. Let's go there. Just read that one real quick. Paul says to them, now we know that what things soever the law saith, it may saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. All right, so Paul is saying the law itself doesn't save you. Rather, a man is justified by faith. We have pistis, which is the noun, pistao in Greek, which is the verb. We have to say faith and believe. In English, we have two words that don't sound alike. In Greek, they have one word that works for both as a root. We conclude that man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. And Paul goes on to say that, right, in chapter 3, 27 and 28. Let's read that. Where is the boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Question mark. Of what works? Nay, but by the law of faith. So not the Mosaic law. Is he the God of the Jews only? He says in verse 29. Is he also not essentially the God of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles only. Also, of the Gentiles also. Paul brings in, right, Messiah multiple times in Romans. We don't have time to go through all those examples, but you certainly see it right at the end when he's talking to the chief of the Jews, right, in Acts 28:20. Let's just go there really quickly. Because he uses a peculiar phrase, one that would be known to people who are educated in the law of the Jews. He says, once again, he's called the leaders of the Jews. This is before they have the day-long meeting. And he says, for this cause, therefore, I have called for you, to see you and to speak with you, because that for the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain. The hope of Israel. And that is a phrase that comes out of Jeremiah. The hope of Israel was the hope of a Messiah who would be the son of David, who would reestablish the monarchy. It's what the word basileia means in Greek. It's what malkuth means in. Yes, a government, specifically a monarchy, where all the power flows out of one point, and it's all three branches of government, if you will. We in America don't comprehend that because we have a very different system.
We have a system?
We're going to get to that comment. It's on here too. You'll see. I got that at the end because you're yeah. Nothing in life seems to be simple, right? And this book of Romans is not simple. It's got a lot of stuff in it. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ has made me free from the law of sin and death, Paul says, right, in chapter 8, 1 through 4. I think that's something we can all latch on to and apply to ourselves. Once again, context, right? I mean, Paul's saying it to the Jews, but you look at it and go, yeah, the Spirit of Christ. Well, we were never under the law. I mean, I'm not Jewish. I was never under the law. The fact that he's made us free of the law of sin and death, that comes up next. Or I get 2 slides. That's where I want to be. More about the law. Okay, just to tie this off, because we've got just a few minutes left. Another contrast, right? Applying the context that we have here or surrounding the letter to the Romans. You have the circumcised ones, in Greek, paratome. It's an adjective. It's the circumcised ones. You have to add the noun. It's a figure of speech meaning the law of practicing Jews. and the cosmotic context, that is to say the worldly context, right? Circumcision is effectively genital mutilation. We all know this, right? But that's what makes it really bizarre, right? When you look at it from the perspective of the Hellenists, right? It was frowned upon by the cultured members of Roman society. Like, what are you doing, right? You Jews are really weird, right? That's understandable, right? Given their context, the context of the Hellenists. Uncircumcised ones, the akrabustia, that's actually a term not known to the Greeks. Greeks did not use that term. They actually had a different term. It had to do with you've got you still have the peritome. You still have the circular skin, right? This is a term that was used as an epithet. It was made up. It basically applied to anybody who could not circumcise their male children on the 8th day. If you lived any distance from Jerusalem, forget it, right? So, context again. This had been going on. The fact that you couldn't follow the law to the letter, that had been going on since the first diaspora, right? Since the Assyrians dragged a bunch of people away. And that was back in 600 BCE, which would be, more than almost 700 years before, actually it's more than that. I've got a slide, we can look that up if you want. Oh, it's right here. Which works really well if you have 2 mice. Okay, so Assyrian captivity 800 years prior to the book of Romans being written, and the Babylonian captivity being 660 years prior. The word for diaspora, the matching word in Hebrew is galut, means exile. You've been exiled to another land, a foreign land. All right, so those dates are here. Paul comes right to the point. He says he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, right? There were 8 million Jews in the world at the time. Only 2 million of them roughly were in Palestine, were within reach of Jerusalem, and could follow the law. The other 6 million, you're out of luck, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff you can't do. Can't even pay your temple taxes, right? That's hard. Nowadays, we fixed that one, Bob, in government, right? You send your check. Right? You can send it electronically. Okay. Well, then what advantage does it have to be a Jew? Well, Paul comes to that point, too. He says, much every way, but chiefly to them were committed the oracles of God, the things that speak. Prophets and the prophetic writings, right? The Torah. We're going to hit these really quick. Paul comes to the point and says the law is impotent. It was a burden to the diaspora. They couldn't follow it. And it's replaced, right? He says the law of the Spirit of life. This is the replacement, right? Free from the law of sin and death. From what the law could not do. God sending his own Son in the flesh, condemning sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us. No, he's not trying to impose the law upon anybody. He's trying to point out that Jesus Christ has fulfilled the law. He has another key contrast here between flesh, sin and death, and the Spirit of life. If you read that particular passage, there's the Spirit of life, the Spirit of God, and the Spirit of Christ. He uses those together. He says in 8:10, and if Christ be in you, the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit of life, Spirit is life because of righteousness. Well, there again, that's not limited to Jews. I think we can also apply that to ourselves. Can lay hold of that truth. Christ died for all of us, right? The Spirit itself, it beareth witness with our spirit that we are children of God. That again, children of God. There's the sons of God and there's the children of God. I think we can lay hold of that one too. And then he mentions the creation, the fact that the creation groaneth. I think most of you are familiar with that particular passage, right? corruption meaning, even the great redwood forests and the bristlecone pines, which are 1,000 years old, eventually die, right? The whole creation is stuck in this malady of sin and death. It's affecting every part of it. Just some standalone kind of thoughts here, right, in terms of the uniqueness of the Acts period. We touched on Paul's desire to impart to the believers in Rome a spiritual gift. That is something that would flow from him directly from God. We mentioned before children of God, but believers in the Acts period are called sons of God. Galatians 4:4. I'll go there real quickly. As our time is about up. Galatians 4:4 says, "When the fullness of time is come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons." What that actually says in the Greek, it has to do, if you're adopted, you have a full portion, you're an heir. H-E-I-R, an heir. This should not come as a surprise to anyone. Believers in the Acts period were ecclesia. They were out-called ones. They could all be called out in positions for a special service. There were all sorts of functions and positions. I think we've talked about Pentecost before. Another interesting point, right? I think this is probably pretty obvious, right? But the Spirit came directly to believers as opposed to what we're used to today. In Pentecost, you had the tongues of fire that showed up with the rushing wind. On the road to Damascus, when Paul got sidetracked there, Ananias, a disciple in Damascus, was visited by Jehovah in a dream, basically, vision. Signs and wonders and miracles, that's been discussed in a previous presentation, so I won't go into detail on that. It's interesting to note that ecclesia gifts included many functions. In the King James, it's translated offices. It's the Greek word praxis. It literally means a mode of transaction, so a function. A job, I mean, that's another way to say it, right? And here's what's listed in Romans 12:4-8, prophecy, ministry, which is dispensing, teaching, exhortation, giving, ruling, mercy. That's a different kind of list than, the list of signs and wonders, right? These are functions that out-called could and did perform. All right, just to finish up here, we just got a couple more slides. Let me just double check here. Yeah, okay. Sin and death and justification. I think many of you are familiar with these passages if you've read them before. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed unto all men, for that all have sinned. That's Romans 5:12. The first man, Adam, he was athanatos, right? Which means, it's translated immortal, but that's incorrect, an incorrect translation. What that should read is he was without death. Death was not working in him when he was formed by God. It's different than not being able to die, right? It's kind of a fundamental difference there. The contrast that comes up in Romans is the offense of the one, the righteousness of the one, right, of the Messiah. The implication, sin and death through, so sin, death through sin, right, this is back to Adam and his role in all of this, but those have both been removed together by the act of Messiah dying on the cross. But that is a blessing that we will not see until the kingdom is manifest, right? Those that are raised to live in the kingdom, death will not be working in you. You think about this conference is about the Acts period. In the Acts period, you could say that the out-called have the same benefit, right? If somebody was sick, they could heal them. So they had that element, right? People that died in the Acts period who were believers died for a reason, not because death was killing them off, like it is today. All right, so there was that one section about, well, what about baptism? That's got to be something that we can fit the church in here someplace, but I think it's important to recognize that, one of the key passages that's used to bring baptism into this book is really in need of translation, right? Therefore, let's start up here. Know ye not that as many of us were baptized into Jesus Christ, were baptized into his death? Well, if you think of that as a water ceremony, you're already in trouble, right? Baptized into his death with a water ceremony. Okay. Therefore, we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in the newness of life. Once again, baptized into death. Right? That only makes sense if you realize the word baptism needs to be translated. It's identification resulting in a merger. That's a good definition for it. Then that phrase from Paul makes some sense. So we're identified with him in his death. His resurrection becomes our resurrection, right? It's kind of the conclusion of the matter, because Paul comes to that conclusion and writes it down. He says, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? That's the next piece, right? Well, if you're forgiven, you can kind of do whatever you want, right? He says, let our thinking not come to that. Because the truth is, we're dead to the law by the body of Christ. The Jews were delivered from the curse of the law. But it would be a blasphemy of sorts to just say, okay, well, now we can just go about doing whatever we want to do because we are free from the sin of the world, right? The sin that has been removed. One last application. This is a misapplication, right? Let's just go through this really quickly. This is a Romans 8:28. It says, and we know that all things work together for good for them that love God, and to them are called according to his purpose. Well, a little interpretation of that would make out all things, quote unquote, to be mediators between God and man. Yeah, think about that one for a minute. Okay. The three oldest manuscripts, the Codex Vaticanus, the Alexandrinus, and the one that I can't pronounce, which came from Mount Sinai, right, contain the word theos twice in this passage, and this is the way I would translate it. And we know that God is working let me start again. And we know that God is working all together for them that love God, to them that are called, it's in kletos, according to his, and I added this, his Acts period purpose. When he made that statement in 8:28, that's the context. So, if you walk away with one thing in this presentation, context, context, context. If you can apply it, it's tough, it's hard work. But if you can apply it, good stuff comes out of it. All right, to Bob's comment about government. Have you ever, this is the joke out of the Monty Python movie, Romani ite domum. Romans go home, that's what that says. And they're writing it on, they're painting graffiti on the Pretoria there in Jerusalem. Have you ever noticed in the epistle to all that be in Rome, which is the capital city of the despised Roman Empire, in all of the 15 chapters, never once does Paul stray into ancient world politics. It's interesting. In other books, right, of the New Testament, he goes after groups of people for their practices and things, right? You're eating blood. You're eating blood sacrificed to idols or something, right? Food sacrificed to idols. He gets into that. But in Romans, doesn't touch it. Doesn't touch religious politics either. These inferences, right, about the Hellenistic culture and their pantheism and Judaism, doesn't go into all that. His focus is on different set of messages, right, that constitute his gospel to them that be in Rome. So it's a bit of an object lesson. I mean, that's kind of my conclusion. Letter to the Roman, all that be in Rome, the Jews that be in Rome. It's an object lesson. Thus saith Yahweh Elohim, although I have cast them far off among the Gentiles, and although I have scattered them among the countries, yet I will be a little sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. It's a quote from Ezekiel. So God had driven them out of the land. They'd been scattered multiple times. But he was always there for them as a little sanctuary. That's all I have. I hope you got something out of that material.